Hi, I'm Lisa from Lori's Country Cottage. Welcome to How Tuesday. Today I'm going to show you how to square up a quilt when you're done quilting it or when it comes back from your quilter. Is there anything more satisfying than cleaning off those rough batting and backing edges when you pick up your quilt from having it quilted or when you quilt it yourself? I just love looking at my quilt when it's all cleaned up. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So first, let's just talk about what do you need. Well, put a nice sharp blade in your rotary cutter. We're going through lots of layers, and if your quilt is big, you're doing some significant cutting. You can upgrade to your 60mm cutter if you want, especially if you have used a double layer of batting or you're having thicker layers together. I'm just going to use my regular one today. And then you're going to want to use the largest square ruler you have. Most people have a 12.5-inch square. This is a 14. I use mostly my Big Easy. That's 12.5 by 24.5 because I have a 24-inch length to cut up one of the sides of my quilt, and the 12.5 is enough to square it up. But I also have a 20.5-inch square ruler, which works awesome for squaring up a quilt. Today, just for the ease of the video, I'm going to use my Big Easy, my 12.5 by 24.5-inch ruler to square up my quilt. So why would we have to square up our quilt? If it went to the quilter all square, why do we need to square it up? Well, in the process of quilting, whether you quilt it at home or you take it to someone to have it quilted, the process of putting it on a machine or stretching out the backing and adding the backing and then layering can sometimes distort our quilt. And then as it's quilted, just the process of quilting usually shrinks your quilt a little bit. And sometimes borders can get pulled offline. So it's important before we attach our binding to make sure our quilt is square. So I'm going to open up my quilt. It's a perfect example to show you all kinds of tips and tricks with different kinds of blocks. So I'll be right back and we'll square up my quilt. All right, let's start with our first example. This is just a table runner, but if you're doing a quilt or any project that has a border all the way around, squaring up your quilt is really easy. What you're going to do is measure from your seam line out to the size that you want your finished border to be, keeping in mind that you're going to attach the binding. So I've cut this one at 2 inches. So I'm going from the 2-inch line out there, and then also here, I'll find my 2-inch line. So I'm actually looking for my corner of 2 inches and 2 inches. I'll line this up at the 2-inch line and line this up at the 2-inch line. Now, when I laid this on the table, I on purpose gave it a little tug. So you can see it matches all the way up to here. So you may need to take your quilt and nudge it in the right direction so that it continues to line up. Now I'm nice and straight all the way up to here, but now it needs to come this way. So I'm just going to hold my ruler and just ease that fabric. And now I have a perfectly straight line, and I'll take my rotary cutter, cut all the way up as long as it's still lined up. And I'm lucky I can cut on both sides of my table, and then I would cut this side and I have a perfectly square corner and exactly 2 inches. And you don't worry about whether you have a little bit of batting sticking out here. It's hard to see there. I have a little bit of batting but no fabric there because I'm going to stitch my binding onto that. You don't want to have, you know, your fabric back here. You may need to trim a bit off, but that's how to trim up a project that has a border all the way around. But my spooky Shelfie quilt is completely different. I have no borders on this quilt at all. I've got piece blocks here. As we get a little farther up, I'm going to have some points on stars I don't want to lose. So here's how we're going to do spooky Shelfie. I'm going to look at this because that should be a straight seam and see So it's going to line up on the 4-inch line. I can't line anything up here, but I can line this up here. So where is that? That looks to be, I think I'll do 3 inches. So I'm lining up this seam line because it's a straight line. I'm going to do 3 inches here, but I'm using this up here at 4 inches. So this is a longer line. I'm going to use that as my main axis. And then if I have to pull anything here, oh, that looks really straight. So 3 here, 4 there. And now I can make my first cut. So usually I cut backwards just right there to get through that batting. And then just a nice smooth. Now, if you have a really long ruler and you're not comfortable, you can anchor your right hand and move your left hand to just hold that ruler. Now, don't move the ruler because we need to make this cut. So I'm going to slide over to the other side of my table, hold my ruler, and make my second cut. And now I have a gloriously beautiful corner on my quilt. And so now the process is just a matter of moving your quilt along. Make sure your backing is out of the way. Have you ever cut through that? And your batting. And now here comes the big easy again. And now what am I going to line up? Well, I see this is here. There's my 4 mark. When I look at my quilt, I have 2 points here I don't want to lose. So I'm going to line up my 4, and now I'm watching here. I need a 1/4 inch, and actually I like to stitch my binding on at 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to make sure I've got 3/8 of an inch and see how that works. Here's my 3/8. Oh darn, I can't see it. There we go. There's my 3/8 right there on that point. That lands me pretty good on my 3/8 there, little bit out. So I'm going to give that corner a bit of a tug. He's been folded for a while. Back I go. 4-inch mark here. I'm at a 1/4 inch there. And again, I moved my ruler, and a 1/4 inch there. So I'm going to move over to 3/8. I'm going to pull my quilt here to 3/8. All right. And now here's my 4-inch line. I've got another line to watch. Yeah, so I can see my quilt is doing this. That's why I'm having a hard time lining this up with that corner. So I need to, it's just so hard working with big quilts. Give myself some fabric, hold on to that, and give my quilt a tug. All right, here we go again. This is why it's so much easier when you're working with borders. So I just lined up my 3/8 there. Now my point is at 3/8. And I look at this line here, and I'm on the 7/8 line. And give that a little talking to. There we go. When I move it with my hand, I'm always, once I move it, I squish it here. Now I have to look where this fabric is. It's right on the 1/4 inch line, but I'm going to stitch at 3/8 of an inch. And I think everything is wonderfully lined up. There's 3/8 and there's 3/8. Now I need to move my ruler back. I'm going to also, lucky me, I get to cut around the corner of this. So is there any way to line this up? Well, I'm looking at this stitch line. That is perfectly square. So I'm good to finish my cut here and to cut along the top. So here goes a nothing. I cut my borders super slow. And again, I'm lucky. I can walk around my sewing table and cut from the other side. That was a bit of a reach if I wanted to go across the top. So there's my second corner. That's all square. So now I'm going to turn my quilt and we'll head up the other side and see what other fancy cutting we need to do. All right, turn my quilt. And always be careful to spread your quilt out so that you don't accidentally cut through your folded quilt underneath. That would be a disaster. And I like to give that backing a little tug so that it's not under either. All right, so my corner is square. I can lay my ruler on nice and square here, and then I'm going to check a line. So here's a stitching line. It's right at the 1, 2, 3.5. So it seems like it's going that way a little bit. I give my quilt a little tug. Check on my line here. And there we go. Now it's a straight line. I've got a straight line here and it lines up on the bottom there. And I can trim. And I'm going to continue to do this all the way up my quilt. So I'm going to start here, straight line. And then I'm going to check something along here. Like I've got lots of straight lines to look at. That looks really nice. That looks really good. And then I'm going to look at this straight line. Well, that's completely straight. Lucky me. There we go. Look how the quilt looks as you're trimming all that off. It's so amazing. So I'm going to continue trimming my quilt all the way around, and then we'll come back and see what it looks like. The most common problem people have when squaring up their quilt is that in the process of adding borders sometimes, or even the quilting, our corners tend to wow out. So squaring up your quilt will just take that extra fabric off, and if you have borders on your quilt, that's not a problem. If you are trimming right up to points and your points aren't perfect, you just have to do the best you can. Quilting isn't perfect. We are hand makers, we aren't machines. Well, my spooky Shelfie is all trimmed. I'm ready to put on the binding. I've got my binding ease tool. I'm going to go cut my strips and get the binding on my quilt. Thanks for joining me for How Tuesday today. I hope you enjoyed learning how to square up your quilt.